Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 16. Cabin Fever. It's amazing how a giant mansion can feel so small. The damn thing is bigger and more spacious than the entire apartment building Bucky and Peter shared before, but somehow the simple rule of not being allowed to step a foot outside has made it impossibly small, much more confined than their studio apartment ever did. Bucky manages well enough for the most part. It's not like he's a stranger to imprisonment, but the effect it has on Peter is palpable. Peter exhausts this place's novelty charm in just a few days. He's explored the mansion top to bottom, taking his time to get accustomed with the gym and the library and the rec room to his heart's content, but the only thing that seems to give him any reprieve from his restlessness, Bucky notices, is spending time in the lab with Tony. He tries not to feel slighted by it. He really, really does. This is good for Peter. He knows it is. What could be better for a student of STEM than spending one-on-one time in a lab with one of the most brilliant scientists on Earth? More than that, what could be better for a kid than getting to learn from his own personal hero, especially when said hero is acknowledging and investing in his potential? What kind of dad would Bucky be to deny him that? It's an opportunity that shouldn't be turned away, and more importantly, it's Peter's dream. Bucky would never want anything less for him. He wants Peter to get recognized for his brilliance. He wants him to get to spend time with his idol, and he wants him to not feel like a prisoner here, to enjoy being stuck in this place as much as he possibly can while they are. He would much rather Peter find some joy in this situation than be miserable and cooped up. So why does he feel so irritated? Steve teases him that he's jealous, but it's not like that. Bucky hates seeing Peter depressed and agitated, bored out of his mind, and longing to go home, and those moments where Tony walks in and asks him if he wants to go down to the lab, and Peter's face lights up like his whole day just got brighter. Bucky loves those moments, seeing the tension and anxiety slip away from him, leaving a glowing smile in their wake. That's the best feeling in the whole world, right there, watching his kid cheer up, seeing that joy and excitement take over him. He doesn't care if he's not the one who caused it. It's just odd watching Peter rant and rave and shower someone else with his infectious enthusiasm. It's odd watching him eagerly stick to someone else's side, staring at him with those wide, adoring eyes like Tony hung the stars in the sky. It's odd to have Peter close by and yet feel like he's so far away, farther than he's felt since the day Bucky took him in. There's a touch of loneliness there, Bucky knows that. But that's not the weirdest or worst part. It's odd to watch Peter shift his hero worship, as Steve had called it, to someone else. But it's worse to see how much better Peter could thrive in someone else's care. It's the insecurity, really, that's the worst part. It's the worst because he knows it's true. Tony is, in a lot of ways, better equipped for these responsibilities than Bucky ever was. He doesn't doubt that he loves Peter more than Stark is even capable of, but he also knows that if Stark had been the one who had Peter that day he got sick, he wouldn't have been even half as useless as Bucky had been. It's the insecurity of knowing that Tony is a free man, one who can afford healthcare and clothing and an apartment that isn't the size of a shoebox. It's the insecurity of knowing that Tony can understand Peter's hobbies and interests deeper than Bucky can ever pretend to, that Tony can in every single way give him a better future than Bucky ever could. He knows no one can come close to loving Peter as much as he does, but what does that matter in the long run? Loving Peter isn't going to help him get ahead in this world, especially when this world is even newer to Bucky than it is to him. The love he feels for him isn't enough. But it's the only thing Bucky has to give. So it's awful, in a lot of ways, to watch Peter interact with someone who can give him all the things Bucky can't. Things Bucky wants Peter to have. Things Peter utterly deserves. He's always known that he's not what's best for Peter, but it's so much worse to watch it in front of his very eyes. To have his own shortcomings shoved in his face in a way he can't ignore. It's not jealousy, despite what Steve might think. It's the unavoidable fact that if Bucky truly wanted what's best for Peter, he would let him go. And that thought is unbearable. He's ashamed of his own selfishness, that he can admit to himself that he's not the best person to take care of Peter and yet refuse to give him up. Can he really claim to be Peter's dad if he doesn't put his needs before his own wants? Can he really claim to love Peter more than anyone else if he denies him the chance to have a better life? There's no reason you can't have it both ways, Buck. Bucky turned his gaze away from his cup of coffee, glancing at Steve skeptically. What do you mean? Forgetting the money issue for a moment, what does Tony really have that you don't? He's grateful for the serious tone in the man's voice that Steve is genuinely trying to help him solve his problems. Resources? Connections? He doesn't have to be Peter's dad to give him those things. From what I've seen, Tony seems pretty happy to mentor Peter anyway. He takes a slow sip of his coffee. Yeah, I guess so. And after we clear your name, Steve continues, and your citizenship is reinstated, Tony won't have anything that you don't. Give or take a couple dozen $1 billion. Steve chuckles. Well, yeah, but most people aren't billionaires, and that doesn't make them unfit parents. Yeah. Bucky agrees, biting down on the urge to replay that he's pretty sure most parents aren't given that option. You're right, I don't necessarily think Peter would be happier with someone else, it's just... He glances upstairs across the open room at the hall leading to the basement where Peter and Tony are working away. Doubt. I get it, Steve says, looking down at his own cup, resting his arms on the island counter. It makes sense. You've been through a lot. It's small, but Bucky still sees Steve's shoulders tighten slightly. And you took on the toughest job imaginable pretty much immediately. I think the fact that you're worrying about this at all just shows how much you love him. I'm happy if he's happy, Bucky says, admitting to it like he's ashamed. Does that make me a bad parent? Being satisfied with the quaint and peaceful life we have together instead of pushing him to want more, like he deserves? I know that I'm content to have things stay the way they are, but is it selfish of me to believe Peter when he says he is too? He rests his upper body on the counter, encircling his coffee mug with his arms. Stark's cabinets are full of high-end dishes and cutlery, but Bucky's been washing and reusing the mug Peter gave him for days now. I'm not blind, Steve. I know that Peter could do anything he wanted if he had the opportunity. And I know Stark can give him those opportunities. Maybe you're right, and I don't have to remove myself completely from the picture to let him have those things. But what does it say about me? As someone who's supposed to be his dad, that I want the quiet life we had together to be enough for him. You're human, Buck. People don't stop being people when they become parents. No, I don't think you're selfish for wanting to stay with your son. After almost a year of hearing people refer to Peter as his son, it isn't odd anymore. But it is odd how warm he feels hearing it come from Steve. Peter makes me feel inconveniently human, he mutters, and Steve laughs, almost spilling his coffee under the counter. It's taken me a long time to even understand the concept of wanting things, you know. It's been a long, uncomfortable battle, but I'm finally at the point where I can say that I want to be Peter's dad. It's who I am now. Sometimes who we are is who we are to other people, Steve says softly, and in that moment Bucky realizes that he might be the only person in the world who understands. He also woke up alone in this strange new world, and since then his identity has probably been reduced to only who he is to other people. Captain America, the only part of him this world remembers. But you're more than that too, Buck. You're also you! Bucky gives a short, mirthless laugh. I don't really know who that is, Steve. Steve's hand leaves the handle of his coffee mug and lays over Bucky's own, giving it a small, reassuring squeeze. Let me remind you. Another laugh startles its way out of him, genuine this time. He playfully lets his shoulder knock against Steve's, practically already touching from how close their bar stools are to each other. Careful there, Rogers. Trying to jog my memory didn't exactly go well last time. Yeah, well, I'm stubborn, Steve says lightly with a small shrug and a playful grin. I don't need to be reminded of that. They share a laugh, and it feels good joking around with Steve. It feels natural somehow, the way New York had felt natural. Not exactly familiar, not in any conscious way he recognizes, but something he just does. His body remembering how, an old awakened muscle memory. When this is all over, Steve begins, somewhat hesitantly, would you consider staying with us at Avengers Tower? With Peter, of course. Bucky raises an eyebrow at him. You think Stark would be okay with that? I don't see why he wouldn't be. It's not like we don't have the room. A small shred of doubt nags at him.
"And you plan on staying there?" he asks, broaching the subject cautiously. "Even with everything going on with the Accords?"
Steve kind of looks like he wants to groan miserably, but he sends Bucky a small smile that isn't nearly as reassuring as he thinks it is and says, "I trust that my team and I will pull through this." He looks down at his copy, still smiling, but there's a weight to it now. The barest hint of tenseness in his body, Captain America putting on a show. He considers pressing him on it, encouraging him to open up, the way Steve has for him so many times already. It's more than thinking Steve needs a friend right now. Bucky wants to be there for Steve, to listen, if that will help make him feel better. It startles him a little, that realization, to learn that despite not even remembering ever seeing it before, the sight of that sad puppy dog look on Steve's face can still make Bucky want to comfort him. Just as he opens his mouth to tell him as much, both their attentions are grabbed by the soft sound of footsteps padding into the room. They lift their heads in unison to glance down the hall, just as Peter rounds the corner, grinning when he sees them.
"Stark sent you up for another snack?"
Bucky asks, pretending to read the clock on the wall.
"What, has it been 5 minutes already?"
"Hoo-hoo!" Peter says, still grinning, but swiping an apple from the fruit bowl on the counter all the same.
"No, he just had to take a call." "What are you guys working on down there?"
Steve asks, as if Bucky hasn't just spent the last 2 hours complaining that Peter won't tell him.
"Oh, we're just tinkering," Peter replies, smiling at Steve, probably able to tell that neither of them believe him, if the way he starts rambling is anything to go by. "Just, practicing coding and theorizing and playing around with different alloys and stuff, just for fun, just playing around."
"Right," Steve says, the tone in his voice confirming that he definitely doesn't believe him, which is good, because Peter is lying.
"You guys aren't making bombs down there or something, are you?"
"Oh," Peter starts, shaking his head fiercely when Steve raises an eyebrow at him.
"No, of course not! Nothing like that! It's nothing!" "Okay, well, at least we've established that there's an it you don't want to talk about."
Peter's face tightens into an indignant little frown, obviously not thrilled at being caught in a lie. That's not the expression Bucky had been expecting or even hoping for. He thought Peter would be sheepish, maybe even a little guilty at being called out like that. But the kid gets this stubborn look in his eyes, like this is a battle he wants to fight and refuses to back down from.
"We know you're not making bombs, Pete,"
Bucky says, drawing Peter's attention away from his eye battle with Steve.
"And it's alright if you don't want me to know, as long as you remain safe."
Now, the sheepish, guilty look Bucky had been expecting crosses Peter's face, and his whole body language changes, the fight abandoned.
"Oh, no, it's not that I don't want you to know, it's just, we're being safe, I promise. We're not doing anything bad." "Okay."
He doesn't want to make his kid feel guilty, and he certainly doesn't want to force him to do anything. He can see that Peter isn't enjoying this any more than he is, so he lets it go, reminding himself that this is Peter. He's young, yes, and certainly naive sometimes, but he knows right from wrong. Bucky trusts him, even if that means extending a little more trust to Stark than he's really comfortable with. Steve clears his throat, offering up a changing conversation as he says,
"It's a beautiful day out."
Peter glances out the large window surrounding them, the guilt on his face ebbing away as he takes in the bright, warm spring day, the sun glistening off the lake, not a cloud in the sky to be seen. There are herons standing in the shallow water near the shore, and above the newly budding flowers in Stark's backyard garden, butterflies circle in tiny flecks. Bucky watches as Peter trails his gaze over the expanse of wildlife beyond their pretty prison windows, and wishes they were here by choice. It would be so much fun being in a place like this with Peter willingly, getting to show him what being in a woods is really like, watching him explore the wilderness for the first time. He can imagine what kind of excited questions the boy would have about everything, and pictures them finding out the answers together, bonding over these new things in this new place. It would be the kind of trip he could never forget, bringing Peter to a place like this. If only they could go outside. It would certainly help lessen the restlessness they've both been feeling, especially for Peter. It might not be as effective as returning to Queens, but he's sure a day out in the woods at the lake would make both of them feel a lot less stir-crazy. As if reading his mind, Steve takes that exact moment to say, "You guys want to get some sun?"
He's not sure who looks more surprised, but both he and Peter turn and fix Steve with uncomprehending stares.
You'd let us go outside?
Bucky asks, unmistakably confused.
T'Challa verified your alibis, he says. You guys aren't being detained, you're being sheltered. We probably shouldn't stay out too long in case somebody thinks to check this place out, but I think it's unreasonable to say we can't spend some time in the backyard for a while. We're pretty secluded here.
Can we? Peter says, and the excitement in his voice and the grin on his face make Bucky worry a little that the kid's been feeling even more cooped up than he thought. He's definitely been spending too much time in that basement, that's for sure.
You'll need sunscreen,
he says to Peter, nodding at the boy's pale skin down when he glances at them curiously.
You step into direct sunlight like that, you'll catch fire.
You're as pale as I am! Peter laughs. Bucky glances down at himself. The way sunlight trailing in from the window makes his skin look white as snow.
Fair enough. We'll both need sunscreen.
Unfortunately, applying sunscreen with a metal arm is a nightmare! Bucky doesn't even need to touch the stuff to know that he'd be able to feel it seep between the plates and the casings of his finger joints, so he keeps the tube firmly in his left hand and works to apply the cream with his right after Peter's been thoroughly painted in it. The kid has patches of white unblended sunscreen still splattered across his face and arms, but that's alright. Bucky kind of doubts they'll be outside long enough for him to burn up, so he only lightly teases Peter about it as he starts rubbing the sunscreen across his own face, neck, and shoulders with a lot less care. Once they're both sufficiently protected from any risk of burning, Steve authorizes Friday to disarm the doors leading onto the deck. Peter steps through immediately, sighing happily when the sun warms his face. Bucky smiles as he watches him following behind, staying next to Steve as the kid makes his way down the long dock protruding off the deck. Then Peter breaks into a run. Bucky doesn't even have time to shout his name before the kid is whooping excitedly and jumping off the end of the dock, curling into a ball in midair before he hits the water. Steve laughs, but whether it's at Peter's shenanigans or the incredulous look on his face, Bucky isn't sure. He knows something is wrong when the man's laughter abruptly stops, and he eyes him before asking, "Is your arm waterproof?"
Don't you dare.
Bucky says immediately, turning on Steve with a defensive wide-eyed look.
I'm serious, Steve, if you even think of...
Fuck! He breaks into a run to dodge Steve's grabbing hands, realizing a second too late that he's headed for the end of the dock, which is a dead end if he wants to avoid getting wet. Steve is hot on his heels, and Bucky can't help but laugh as he's chased spurred on by Peter's encouraging shout of, "Run, Dad!" before he's trapped at the water's edge. The two of them start grappling when Steve reaches him, both grinning, trying to shove the other into the water first. Bucky can tell that Steve isn't really trying, which is his loss, and manages to back him up against the edge of the dock nearly far enough to throw him into the lake. That's when Steve decides he's actually serious about not getting thrown in, and he tightens his hold on Bucky's shoulders, only to stumble backward and into the water with a surprise shout as he trips over a line of web behind his feet, sending him off balance and flailing as he goes down. Bucky looks over and sees Peter grinning at him from the water, his hand and wrist sticking up above the surface to reveal the line of webbing he shot from his web shooter to one of the deck's posts, creating a line at the perfect height to trip Steve up. Bucky returns the kid's smile, grateful for his interference. Steve is much less amused. "I demand a rematch," he says, pushing his soaked wet bangs off his forehead, "after someone's learned a lesson about cheating." Peter sinks a little deeper into the water, then from a yes when Steve dips below the surface, diving toward it. He scrambles away in the water, kicking his legs and laughing as he tries to dodge around Steve.
Aye.
Bucky snaps at him with fake vehemence.
They might get along.
Steve reels back and splashes an entire handful of water at him, soaking his whole front. "Make me!" And really, that's a challenge you can't refuse. Swimming is nice, but lounging on the soft green grass in the warm sun is better, at least in Bucky's opinion. Peter clearly doesn't think so, choosing instead to construct himself a rope out of his webbing so he can swing into the water from the shore, dangling off a large branch from one of those overhanging trees. Bucky and Steve lounge just far enough back that Peter can run and jump without splashing them, and Bucky's happy that the kid is getting to run around in the fresh air. It's no web slinging around the city, but it's more enjoyable than the few times he's taken him down to the gym and made him work out to try and burn off all his excess energy. At least Peter is having fun like this. And after the past few days of hardly seeing him, Bucky's just glad to have a moment like this at all.
Hey,
Steve says beside him, pulling Bucky from his thoughts.
looks like your sunscreen's washed away.
He looks down at himself, sees the telltale streaks of oil following the tracks of the lake water still dripping off him. He agrees, reaching over for the tube so he can reapply it, only to have Steve snatch it up first.
Here,
He says, shuffling behind Bucky on his knees.
let me.
Bucky gives him a somewhat perplexed look, but shrugs and lowers his head, letting his hair fall to expose his neck and shoulders. He expects Steve to just apply a dollop of cream and spread it over his back neutrally, but to his surprise, Steve moves in close until his knees are practically on either side of Bucky's hips, and his hands start working the sunscreen into his skin, not just spreading it, but massaging it in. He can't help the low, appreciative groan he makes when Steve's large hands knead the muscles of his neck and shoulders, rubbing the cream in until his skin's absorbed it. Steve's hand drifts near the scarred flesh surrounding his docking plate, massaging a little gentler the closer he gets to his prosthetic, and Bucky hesitates to tell him that that's the area he actually needs massaged the most. He hums appreciatively as the other man's thumb presses deliciously into his trapezius.
Is this my reward for kicking your ass in the water or something?
Steve laughs, and the sound is a lot closer to him than Bucky expected it to be.
No, this is because you weren't thorough enough the first time.
He trails his hand down Bucky's back to an area where the skin feels a little tender.
You're starting to burn up down here. Well, if somebody hadn't decided to be a little jackass and try and throw me into a lake, I wouldn't have had to take my shirt off in the first place.
A grin spreads across his face at the sound of Steve laughing again. It feels good, this moment. His son playing in the great outdoors, the sun keeping them warm in the fresh, clean air, Steve's laughter rumbling quietly around him as the tension is pushed and prodded out of his muscles. It's a serene and welcomed peace, this little oasis from the reality of their situation. So, of course, Stark ruins it. Hello, excuse me, Steve, are you out of your goddamn mind? They turn around and look up, see Tony glaring at them over the railing of the deck, his narrowed eyebrows scarcely visible over the rim of his sunglasses. We're not running a summer camp here, and I'm the only one who remembers that there's a mass murderer out there trying to flush the Winter Soldier out of hiding. He continues berating them as he climbs down the steps onto the lawn, not taking his eyes away from Steve and Bucky for an instant. Not to mention the rest of the world, of which some people are already a little suspicious that Iron Man and Captain America together lost a guy on foot and might get the bright idea to start looking in any property suite. Sorry, I own, just to make sure there aren't any Russian terrorist assassins being harbored behind anyone's back. You know these people have drones, right? Do you know what a drone is? Bucky frowns at Stark as the man looms over them and says, I'm not Russian. Tony throws his hands up into the air and Bucky can't see it, but he thinks Steve might be trying to stifle a laugh. I swear you assholes are gonna make me go blind! He gestures upward to the clear sky expanding over the lake in every direction. The last thing we need is for Ross or some government goon to put this place under surveillance and see you two lotioning each other up in my backyard like you're posing for a Playgirl magazine. Tony, Steve says, much more composed. It's been less than an hour. We're just grabbing some fresh air. If you need fresh air, open a window, Tony snaps. Barnes' freedom isn't the only thing on the line here, Cap, and you know it. I've accepted the fact that if we get caught doing this, we'll be on the wrong side of the law, but I'm sure as hell not going to become a fugitive just because my 18,000 square foot mansion started feeling a little too small for you. He tries to resist saying it, he really does, but Bucky can't help but lift an eyebrow at the manly remark.
So you admit you don't actually consider it to be a quaint family cottage after all, huh?
Which is totally worth the light cuff Steve gives him on the back of the head as Tony makes a face like his head is about to pop and angrily roars, Get back inside!
Well, if they didn't know we were here before, they certainly do now.
Bucky mutters, standing up at his own leisurely pace, his attention drawn away from Stark's seething expression when Peter nervously pads up to them. Is everything okay?
Yeah, Pete, everything's fine,
he says before Steve or Stark can interject.
I guess it's time to go back inside now, though.
Peter's little face falls. Oh, really? But I just finished making my swing, he says and gestures behind him down to the shore where he's fashioned a swing out of his webs, suspended from a willow tree. Can't we stay out a little longer? Why don't we go back to the lab? Tony suggests. I came up with some new code to try out during that boring-ass phone call, and I'm excited to see what you think of it. Okay, Peter says, grinning, completely lighting up at the idea. Bucky does his best to hide the flicker of disappointment he feels watching Stark lead his enthusiastic and rambling kid back inside, their fun, apparently one-time-only day at the lake, seemingly forgotten. Steve picks up their discarded shirts and the bottle of sunscreen as they follow the other two inside the house, giving Bucky a sympathetic look as he watches Peter and Tony disappear down into the basement once more.
"Wanna help me find some 2x4s?
He suddenly asks him, startling Bucky somewhat.
What? Bucky says, raising an eyebrow at him. What for? Steve gestures to the windows.
So we can board this place up. Don't want those pesky government drones to zip by and snap a photo of us posing for our next catalog. They're going to have to pay a subscription fee just like everyone else.
Bucky laughs, even though he doesn't entirely understand what Steve is talking about. Is he always that dramatic?
He's always much more dramatic,
Steve replies, but there's an unmistakable touch of fondness in his voice.
He's animated, you get used to it.
I don't know if I want to get used to it, he says honestly, sending the whole to the basement a surly look. But I guess I'd have to if we ended up staying at the tower. He turns to let Steve see the smile crossing his face and watches the other man's shock quickly change into a wide, thrilled grin that makes Bucky feel like they're still down by the shore, bathing in the sunlight. Things slip back into the same routine of the last few days to Bucky's disappointment. He hardly sees Peter, except for the times Tony sends him up to grab something to eat, and while those times are fairly frequent, they're not enough to keep Bucky from missing his kid. But Steve sticks close by him, thankfully. It's like he can sense whenever Bucky starts getting restless and fidgety, because he's always right there whenever he does, offering up a distraction or conversation, successfully taking Bucky's mind off how far away Peter feels. They talk about a lot of things. Steve seems slightly hesitant to talk about their past, which is understandable, so instead, he talks a lot about his team and the missions they've had so far together. It's interesting how different parts of his stories make Bucky feel. At times, hearing of Steve's reckless and outright dangerous antics makes him laugh, and other times he mentally inserts himself into the story as Steve's telling it, imagining what he would have done if he had been there while Steve was fighting aliens and robots and pirate smugglers with little to no concern for his physical well-being. Fighting is something he's completely tired of, so it's odd that he doesn't hate the idea of being there with Steve on the battlefield. There's no joy in it, and while Bucky struggles to remember how he used to feel about things before Hydra took him, he doubts there ever was. He certainly doesn't think he went to war for sport, and it goes without saying that none of the battles Hydra made him fight were ever done so willingly. So he doesn't think he enjoys fighting, and yet it's nice imagining being on a mission with Steve. It's a welcome distraction after days of anguishing over his own insecurities. Steve seems to like listening to his stories about his life back in Queens, both before and after he met Peter. There isn't much to tell on the before side, but Steve does smile happily when Bucky tells him how he acquired his scattered pieces of threadbare furniture, the time he helped the upstairs neighbors move out, and they asked him if he wanted the love seat that wouldn't fit in their trunk, the time the little old lady across the street asked him to help her take her old mattress to the curb, and he offered to take it, finding a 3-legged bar stool beside a dumpster and fashioning a 4th and wobbly leg for it out of an old wooden closet pole. He enjoys hearing about the quiet and domestic life Bucky's lived over the past 2 years, and it serves to highlight just how starkly different their lives have been since they last saw each other. Steve's stories are filled with action, stories of missions and battles, of fights for the world, and the many different people who have come to be a part of his circle. Bucky's stories are more along the line of gently fond little anecdotes, peaceful and familial moments, just about as different from Steve's tales of heroism as one could get. There's nothing terribly exciting about the time Peter brought a box full of wet kittens home, but Steve seemed to love hearing about it just the same. That's how they spend their time together over the next few days. Catching up, as Steve calls it, learning what the other has been through since DC, what their lives have been like. Steve doesn't come close to asking about the 70 years that took place before that, and for that Bucky is grateful. He gets the distinct feeling that
after the last 2 years of desperate searching, Steve knows much more than he wants to anyway. It becomes a sort of routine that Bucky is just beginning to feel comfortable with when Tony walks into the room in a three-piece suit and says, "I have to go back to New York for a bit."
"What?"
Steve says, as caught off guard as Bucky feels.
"For what?"
Ross called a meeting. He fixes the lapel of his jacket, fiddles with his sleeves, a nervous habit.
"And I should check on things anyway. Make people think Iron Man is still hard at work tracking the Winter Soldier down."
"Right, good plan." Steve nods, standing up and walking over to him.
"Keep in touch. We'll be here when you get back."
"Here as in inside, right?" Steve makes a scene of rolling his eyes.
Yes, Tony, you made your points.
"Okay, good." Tony smiles at him, then glances behind Steve and says to Bucky, "Kids in the lab. I told them to finish up and come grab some lunch, so we should be up soon." Bucky nods, then offers up a congenial,
"Have a safe trip,"
which makes Tony look at him sharply, consistently surprised whenever he's shown the barest hint of politeness from him.
"Thanks,"
he says, trying and failing to hide the fact that he suddenly wants to run from the room. "I'll see you guys in a few days, tops."
"See you soon,"
Steve says, and then they watch him leave, listening as a car door slams and its tires roll over the cobblestone driveway. Bucky thought Peter had been restless before, when they'd been cooped up for days with no end in sight. But he realizes now, with no small amount of dejection, that that was nothing compared to being cooped up without Tony around to keep him distracted. Peter has a hard time adjusting to being locked up indoors now that he isn't constantly working on whatever the hell he and Stark were doing down there. He still goes down to the lab once in a while, but Peter's never enjoyed being alone for very long in all the time Bucky's known him, and even the wonders of Stark's multi-million-dollar workshop aren't enough to entice him into being down there by himself for very long. So he starts spending more time upstairs with Bucky and Steve, but it isn't the comfortable, peaceful bonding time Bucky's used to. Peter is bored, and he doesn't find the same satisfaction in sitting together and chatting over coffee that Bucky and Steve do. The kid steadily grows more fidgety as the days of Stark's absence drag on until his anxious pacing devolves into sitting by the bay window and staring at the outdoors longingly. Bucky's heart aches for him. Peter shouldn't be here, locked up and hiding away in the middle of nowhere. He should be at home, in Queens, at school with his friends, where he belongs, not curled up on the windowsill of a fancy prison, watching the days pass by agonizingly slowly, depressed. Steve does his best to cheer them both up, but nothing he tries proves to be anything more than a momentary distraction. Peter does his best to be accommodating, trying to keep his chin up as he lets them try and distract him, but with every day that goes by, his apathy grows, like each day away from home is slowly sucking the life out of him.
"I don't know what to do, Steve,"
Bucky admits to him, gazing at the empty spot at the dining table that Peter left.
"It's never been this bad before."
Steve regards him attentive.
"He's been like this before?"
He nods, sighing.
"Yeah, over the winter. He had given up being Spider-Man, and the weather and shorter days meant we spent a lot of time indoors. He got pretty depressed then, too."
Bucky leans back in his chair, slumping in defeat.
"But not like this. He was still himself, and he had school and his friends to help keep his head up when he wasn't at home. We went out a lot, too. I think that helped, but here it's like his brain is shutting down with that stimulation or something."
"I don't think Tony really planned on using this place for long-term stays,"
Steve says.
"There's not really a lot to do, but I'm sure if we put our heads together, we can think of something to help keep him occupied."
"Like what?"
Bucky asks.
"Well, what sorts of things does he like?"
He thinks it over for a moment.
"He likes learning things, and he likes working with his hands, building stuff. He and his best friend used to make these giant, elaborate Lego structures all the time. He likes Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, anything science fiction or fantasy. He likes photography."
Bucky mentally scans over the last year of their lives together, recounting every moment with Peter with picture-perfect clarity.
"He loves animals."
Steve nods along, opening up the holographic screen of the Stark pad Tony left them and browsing through what seems to be an online catalog of some kind.
"Okay, well, that's a start. We can order him some stuff that'll help keep him occupied while he's here."
Steve's hand swipes across the holographic screen with practiced ease, impressing Bucky somewhat.
"It'll take a few hours to get the stuff delivered, but you said he loves animals?"
"Yeah,"
Bucky says, glancing at Steve's face curiously.
"Why?"
"Well, if you're feeling up to a bit of mischief," Steve replies, "I know what we can do today."
"Are you sure this is a good idea?"
Bucky asks, apparently taking the words right out of Peter's mouth.
We'll only be gone a few hours,
Steve says assuredly, sliding his sunglasses onto his face and straightening his cap.
and we're not going far.
Where are we going? Peter asks with more spirit in his voice than he's had the last 3 days. Bucky can't bring himself to protest, even though part of him feels like they're tempting fate here.
It's a surprise,
is all Steve says, turning and leading them out the door, missing the way Bucky and Peter look at each other.
a shrug.
They begin the lengthy walk down Tony's excessively long driveway, and Bucky keeps his peripheral gaze on Peter the entire time, watching as the kid slowly reanimates, like every second spent outside is revitalizing him bit by bit. Peter gazes up at the canopy of trees lining the driveway on either side of them, smiling gently to himself at the sight of squirrels leaping through branches and birds gliding through the trees. The sunlight lands in fractured beams across his face, and it soothes a deep, familiar ache in Bucky's chest, seeing Peter safe and happy like this. Steve takes them all the way down to the main road, where they continue on foot down the dirt path beside the road, not a car to be seen. It's quiet here in the yuppie summer cottage district of Montana's countryside, still too early in the spring for people to come and stay. The three of them walk in silence, peaceful and content, Peter's gaze never staying in one place for long, looking around to take everything in. After a long mile, they finally come to another driveway arching off the main road, and Bucky recognizes the sign immediately when they stop in front of the gate.
Steve?
Steve shoots him a quick grin and presses the intercom button beside the closed gates. "Welcome to Pegasus Trail Rides," a woman's voice says through the speaker. "How may I help you?"
Yes, hello,
Steve says politely to the mic.
I was wondering if you have any horses available this afternoon?
Bucky's a little stunned as the front desk attendant walks them to the stables. The ranch is huge! Definitely the kind that caters to the rich summer vacationers who come here every year. The 3-story barn looms over them at the mouth of the field, adjacent to the wide corral where farmhands are leading a few horses in a loop, some sort of training exercise. Peter sticks close to him like he's nervous, but Bucky can see the bubbling excitement in his eyes as they enter the stables and pass by each stall. The kid gawks as she stops them in front of a stall all the way at the end of the stable before pulling open the door. "Holy crap, horses are big!" Peter says, practically hiding behind Bucky as the tall black mare steps forward, towering over all of them. She must be almost 17 hands. Her withers are only a few inches shorter than Bucky's shoulders. "This is Andromeda," the woman says. "She's the best horse we have for beginners. She's big, but she's incredibly tame and gentle. She's also pretty cuddly." Peter doesn't look convinced, but Bucky places a comforting hand on his shoulder and urges him forward with a soft, "Go on, Pete," until the kid swallows and lifts a nervous hand for the horse to sniff, smiling widely as she boops his hand with her nose. "Oh my God, she's so soft!" Bucky gently strokes his hand around her muzzle, Andromeda seemingly utterly content to stand there and bask in their affection.
"So what do you think, kiddo? Think you're up for a ride?"
"Oh," Peter says, pulling his hand back slightly. "Wait, by myself?"
"We can lead you around to start,"
Steve says, accepting the reins as the attendant walks another horse up to him, smiling up at Steve as she does.
"Until you get used to being in the saddle."
"Speaking of," the woman says, "do you boys need any help saddling up?"
"No, thank you. I think we can manage."
Steve smiles politely, thanking the attendant as she finishes matching them up with their horses. Peter bursts out laughing when she introduces Bucky's horse, Brittany's spurs, but neither he nor Steve understand why. Steve and Bucky saddle up their own horses before helping Peter with his. It's exciting teaching Peter new things and watching Steve do the same. Peter is laser-focused and attentive, and Bucky realizes that he's more lifelike than he's been in weeks, even more before this whole mess started. There's something liberating and almost therapeutic about preparing their horses for the trail ride, a kind of soothing, intimate experience as they walk them around the corral, in no rush to mount them. Steve had paid up front for 3 hours after all, and the woman said it was only about 40 minutes to reach the mountaintop. By the time he actually helps the kid up into the saddle, Peter looks happier than Bucky's seen him in months. He's seen Peter excited, sure, and he's definitely seen him laid back, but there's no comparison to the wide, brimming, full-faced smile Peter has when he lifts Andromeda's reins for the first time and she begins walking forward. The kid has a look on his face like he just made a new best friend, and judging by the way the mare had been nuzzling his face before Bucky lifted him into the saddle, she seems to feel pretty much the same way. They let Andromeda lead them on the trail, her gentle walk setting an easygoing pace for their own horses. Bucky and Steve's horses stay side by side the whole way up, and Bucky tries to spot if Steve is doing it intentionally or not, though the results are inconclusive. Peter is focused on his posture and the positioning of his hands on the reins and his feet in the stirrups, but Bucky's amazed to see there's no tension in the line of his shoulders, no anxiety in the way he's carrying himself. He's concentrating, yes, but there's an air of contentedness in the way he's interacting with his horse, gently stroking her neck, speaking to her softly. Bucky idly wonders what it is about this that has flipped Peter's whole mood a complete 180 degrees, and then he realizes that it's everything. He feels it too, and doesn't doubt that Steve does as well. There's something magical about this moment, walking their horses up a secluded forest trail, bathed in pillars of sunlight chiseling through the trees and lining their path, the quiet clapping of hooves on the dirt below, the gentle chirping of birds in the trees above. It feels like their own little world right here. And Bucky knows he's using every muscle in his body to keep properly upright in Brittany Spur's saddle, but he doesn't think he's ever felt more relaxed. When the trail comes to an end, it takes them to a long, artificially made plateau, miles of green grass stretching out toward the cliffside. It looks like an area where the ranch lets their horses graze, but there's no one up here now except them, and Peter grins when he sees the open field and gives an echoing shout of laughter as Andromeda begins to gallop. Bucky catches sight of the wide smile on Steve's face and turns to him, feeling a distinct and welcomed warmth spreading in his chest at the sides. Steve watches Peter gallop across the field, nothing up here but the blue sky above them and the green grass below them, like they've been transported to their own little realm, a private sliver of reality stuck between two planes.
Thank you,
he says, unintentionally startling them both.
For doing this. I think we needed it.
Let's do it again, Steve replies, giving Bucky a warm smile that makes his chest feel tight in an oddly pleasant way. Might be hard to find a spot this majestic in New York, but I think the trip would be worth it.
Definitely.
They walk their horses down the field, watching proudly as Peter canters over the little hills, figuring out what his body language is telling Andromeda to do with the same kind of wide-eyed attentiveness he shows all new things he's excited to learn about. Bucky smiles at the peaceful, loving look on the kid's face as he and his horse grow accustomed to one another on the field, and before he knows it, he and Steve reach the end and their horses stop a few short yards from the cliffside, revealing a stunning view of the lake. Bucky gives Brittany Spurs a gentle pat on the neck as he dismounts, his legs tingling slightly as he walks over to the ledge, where an old log has been tipped onto its side to form a makeshift bench. Steve joins him, and their horses begin to happily graze as they sit and survey the view, the red shine of sunlight gleaming off an eagle's feathers as it soars over the water. I got to ride last year while on a mission in Moldova, Steve says. We had to sneak into a base and needed to use horses to help us move our equipment down the trail. It was too narrow for any vehicle to drive down, and we needed to be as quiet as possible. He smiles, not looking at him, so Bucky lets himself drink in the sight unreservedly. The whole time, all I can think about was the last time I had ridden with you.
I remember,
Bucky says.
The Hydra base in Austria. Gabe fell off his horse and almost got stepped on.
Steve chuckles, a fond expression on his face. You were such a better rider than me, he says. You guys thought I couldn't hear you laughing behind me, but I definitely could. Bucky shrugs, grinning as he says,
It wasn't our fault that shield made you look like a turtle riding a horse.
They both laugh, and Steve leans forward and rests his elbows on his knees as he says, I kept thinking, when I find him, I'm going to take him riding again. He turns his head to look at him through a frame of gold blonde eyelashes, and Bucky swallows the lump that's suddenly taken up residence in his throat. Even if you decide not to stay with us at the tower, I want to do things with you, Buck. I want to have, I want to have things like you and Peter have. Places you like to go, things you like to do together.
I want that with you. For us.
The smile that spreads over his face doesn't surprise him at all.
Yeah, I want that too, Steve.
Steve grins, relief and affection gleaming in his eyes as he straightens his back, opening his mouth to speak, until they spot Andromeda's massive black body trot up behind them and turn to look at her. Peter's not looking at them, his face pointed upwards as he scans the sky as if searching for something.
Dad?
He asks, his eyebrows drawing together. Do you hear that? Bucky frowns, straining to pick up whatever Peter is talking about, watching as Steve does the same. He hears nothing at first, but steadily a low, echoing hum rumbles from beyond the mountain until it's loud and clear enough for them to recognize the familiar roar of Iron Man's suit in flight. Peter's eyes go wide, his face paling as he whips around in his saddle. Bucky and Steve follow his line of sight until they see Tony fly over the tops of the trees, startling the horses as he lands a few feet away from them, Andromeda braying and backing away, shaking her head. The only thought that crosses Bucky's mind as Tony lifts his mask and fixes them with a dark, furious glare is a colorful and resounding "Fuck!"